Shuffle. Cord would bash the kid's head if he saw that contraption, Roland thinks, looking at the travois upon which he had spent the day, and laughs. It isn't much of a laugh. It sounds like one of those waves dropping its load off stones on the beach. He doesn't know how far they have come, but it's far enough for Eddie to be totally bushed. He's sitting on a rock in the lengthening light with one of the gunslinger's revolvers in his lap and a half-full water skin to one side. There's a small bulge in his shirt pocket. These are the bullets from the back of the gun belt, the diminishing supply of good bullets. Eddie has tied these up in a piece of his own shirt. The main reason of the supply of good bullets is diminishing so fast is because 1 every 4 or 5 has also turned out to be a dud. Eddie, who has been nearly dozing, now looks up. "What are you laughing about?" he asks. The gunslinger waves a dismissive hand and shakes his head. Because he's wrong, he realizes. Court wouldn't bash Eddie for the travois, even though it was an odd, lame-looking thing. Roland thinks it might even be possible that Court might grunt some word of compliment, such a rarity that the boy to whom it had happened hardly ever knew how to respond. He was left gaping like a fish just pulled from a cook's barrel. The main supports were 2 cottonwood branches of approximately the same length and thickness. A blowdown, the gunslinger presumed. He had used smaller branches as supports, attaching them to the support poles with a crazy conglomeration of stuff. Gun belts, the glue string that had held the devil powder to his chest, even the rawhide thong from the gunslinger's hat, and his, Eddie's, own sneaker laces. He had laid over the gunslinger's bedroll over the supports. Court would not have struck him because, sick as he was, Eddie had at least done more than squat on his hunkers and bewail his fate. He had made something, had tried, and Court might have offered one of his abrupt, almost grudging compliments because, crazy as the thing looked, it worked. The long tracks stretching back down the beach to the point where they seemed to come together at the rim of the perspective proved that. "You see any of them?" Eddie asks. The sun is going down, beating an orange path across the water, and so the gunslinger reckons he's been out better than 6 hours this time. He feels stronger. He sits up and looks down to the water. Neither the beach nor the land sweeping to the western slope of the mountains had changed much. He can see small variations of landscape and detritus, a Dell seagull for instance, lying in a little heap of blowing feathers on the sand about 20 yards to the left and 30 or so closer to the water. But these aside, they might as well be right back where they started. "No," the gunslinger says. Then, "Yes, there's one." He points, Eddie squints, then nods. As the sun sinks lower and the orange tracks begin to look more and more like blood, the first of the lobstrosities come, tumbling out of the waves and beginning to crawl up the beach. 2 of them race clumsily towards the dead gull. The winner pounces on it, rips it open, and begins to stuff the rotting remains into its maw. "Did it chick?" it asks. "Tongue chum?" responds the loser. "Da-da!" Kablam! Roland's gun puts an end to the second creature's questions. Eddie walks down to it and grabs it by the back, keeping a wary eye on its fellow as he does. The other offers no trouble, however. It's busy with the gull. Eddie brings his kill back. It is still twitching, raising and lowering its claws, but soon enough it stops moving. The tail arches one final time, then simply drops instead of flexing downward. The boxer's claw hang limp. "Dinner will be served soon, master," Eddie says. "You have your choice, filet of crepicrola or filet of crepicrola. Which strikes your fancy, master?" "I don't understand you," the gunslinger says. "Sure you do," Eddie says. "You just don't have any sense of humor. What happened to it?" "Shot off in one war or another, I guess." Eddie smiles at that. "You look and sound a little more alive today, Roland." "I am, I think." "Well, maybe you could even walk for a while tomorrow." "I'll tell you very frankly, my friend, dragging you is pits on the shit." "I'll try." "You do that." "You look a little better too," Roland ventures. His voice cracks on the last 2 words, like the voice of a young boy. If I don't stop talking soon, he thinks, I won't be able to talk at all again. I guess I'll live. He looks at Roland expressionlessly. You'll never know how close it was a couple of times, though. Once I took one of your guns and put it against my head, cocked it, held it there for a while, and then took it away, eased the hammer down, and shoved it back into your holster. Another night, I had a convulsion. I think that was the second night, but I'm not sure. He shakes his head and says something the gunslinger both does and does not understand. Michigan seems like a dream to me now. Although his voice is down to the husky murmur again, he knows he shouldn't be talking at all. The gunslinger has to know one thing. What stopped you from pulling the trigger? Well, this is the only pair of pants I've got, Eddie says. At the last second I thought, if I pulled the trigger and it was one of those dud shells, I'd never get up the guts to do it again. And once you shit your pants, you gotta wash them right away or live with the stink forever. Henry told me that. He said he learned it at Nam. And since it was nighttime and Lester the lobster was out, not to mention all his friends. But the gunslinger is laughing hard, although only on occasion cracked sound actually escapes his lips. Smiling a little himself, Eddie says, I think maybe you got your sense of humor shot off to the elbow in that war. He gets up, meaning to go up to the slope to where there will be fuel for a fire, Roland supposes. Wait, he whispers, and Eddie looks at him. Why, really? I guess because you needed me. If I'd killed myself, you would have died. Later on, after you're really on your feet again, I may, re-examine my options. He looks around and sighs deeply. There may be a Disneyland or Coney Island somewhere in your world, Roland, but what I've seen of it so far really doesn't interest me that much. He starts away, pauses, and looks back again at Roland. His face is somber, although some of the sticky pallor has left him. The shakes have become no more than occasional tremors. Sometimes you really don't understand me, do you? No, the gunslinger whispers. Sometimes I don't. Then I'll elucidate. There are people who need people to need them. The reason you don't understand is because you're none of those people. You'd use me and then toss me away like a paper bag if that's what it came down to. God fuck you, my friend. You're just smart enough so it would hurt you to do that. Just hard enough so you'd go ahead and do it anyway. You wouldn't be able to help yourself. If I was lying on the beach there and screaming for help, you'd walk over me, and if I was between you and your goddamn tower, isn't that pretty much close to the truth? Roland said nothing, only watches Eddie. But not everyone's like that. There are people who need people to need them. Like Barbara Streisand. Corny but true. It's just another way of being hooked through the bag. Eddie gazes at him. But when it comes down to that, you're clean, aren't you? Roland watches him. Except for your tower. Eddie utters a short laugh. You're a tower junkie, Roland. Which war was it? Roland whispers. What? The one where you got your sense of nobility and purpose shot off. Eddie recoils as if Roland had reached out and slapped him. I'm going to get some water, he said shortly. Keep an eye out on the creepy crawlers. We came a long way today, but I still don't know if they talk to each other or not. He turns away then, but not before Roland has seen the last red rays of sunset reflected on his wet cheeks. Roland turns back to the beach and watches. The lobstrosities crawl and question and crawl. But both activities seem aimless. They have some intelligence, but not enough to pass on information to others of their kind. God doesn't always dish it to your face, Roland thinks. Most times, but not always. Eddie returned with wood. Well, Eddie asks, what do you think? We're all right, the gunslinger croaks, and Eddie starts to say something, but the gunslinger is tired now and lies back and looks at the first stars peeking through the canopy of violet sky, and shuffle. In the 3 days that followed, the gunslinger progressed steadily back to health. The red lines creeping up his arms first reversed their direction, then faded, then disappeared. On the next day, he sometimes walked and sometimes let Eddie drag him. On the day following, he didn't need to be dragged at all. Every hour or two they simply sat for a period of time until the watery feeling went out of his legs. It was during these rests, and in those times after dinner had been eaten, but before the fire had burned all the way down, and they went to sleep, that the gunslinger heard about Henry and Eddie. He remembered wondering what had happened to make their brothering so difficult. But after Eddie had begun, haltingly and with a sort of resentful anger that proceeds from deep pain, the gunslinger could have stopped him, could have told him, "Don't bother, Eddie, I understand everything." Except that wouldn't have helped Eddie. Eddie wasn't talking to help Henry because Henry was dead. He was talking to bury Henry for good, and to remind himself that although Henry was dead, he, Eddie, wasn't. The gunslinger listened and said nothing. The gist was simple. Eddie believed he had stolen his brother's life. Henry also believed this. Henry might have believed it on his own, or he might have believed it because so frequently heard their mother lecturing Eddie on how much both she and Henry had sacrificed for him. So Eddie could be safe as anyone could be in this jungle of a city. So he could be happy as anyone could be in this jungle of a city. So he wouldn't end up like his poor sister, and he didn't even hardly remember, but she had been so beautiful, God love her. She was with the angels, and that was undoubtedly a wonderful place to be, but she didn't want Eddie to be with the angels just yet. Run over in the road by some crazy drunken driver like his sister, or cut up by some crazy junkie kid for 25 cents in his pocket and left with his guts running all out over the sidewalk just because she didn't think Eddie wanted to be with the angels yet. He'd just better listen to what his big brother said and do what his big brother said to do, and always remember that Henry was making a love sacrifice. Eddie told the gunslinger he doubted if his mother knew some of the things they had done. Flickering comic books from the candy store on Rikon Avenue, or smoking cigarettes behind the bonded electroplate factory on Coho Street. Once, they saw a Chevrolet with the keys in it, and although Henry barely knew how to drive, he was 16 then, Eddie 8, he had crammed his brother into the car and they were going to go to New York City. Eddie was scared, crying. Henry scared too and mad at Eddie, telling him to shut up, telling him to stop being such a fucking baby. He had $10 and Eddie had 3 or 4. They could go to the movies all fucking day and then catch a felon train and be back before their mother had time to put supper on the table and wonder where they were. But Eddie kept crying near the Queensboro Bridge. They saw a police car on a side street, and although Eddie was pretty sure the cop in it hadn't even been looking their way, he said "yeah" when Henry asked him in a harsh, quavering voice if Eddie thought that bull had seen them. Henry turned white and pulled over so fast that he almost amputated a fire hydrant. He was running down the block while Eddie, now in a panic himself, was still struggling with the unfamiliar door handle. Henry stopped, came back, and hauled Eddie out of the car. He also slapped him twice. Then they had walked, well actually they slunk, all the way back to Brooklyn. It took them most of the day, and when their mother asked them why they looked so hot and sweaty and tired out, Henry said it was because he'd spent most of the day teaching Eddie how to go one-on-one on the basketball court at the playing ground around the block. Then some big kids came in, they had to run. Their mother kissed Henry and blamed Eddie. She asked him if he didn't have the bestest big brother in the world. Eddie agreed with her. This was an honest agreement too. He thought he did. "He was as scared as I was that day," Eddie told Roland as they sat and watched the last of the day dwindle from the water, where soon the only light would be that reflected from the stars. "Scared her, really, because he only thought the cops saw us, while I knew he didn't. That's why he ran. But he came back. That's the important part. He came back." Roland said nothing. "You see that, don't you?" Eddie was looking at Roland with harsh, questioning eyes. "I see. He was always scared, but he always came back." Roland thought it would have been better for both Eddie, maybe better for both of them in the long run, if Henry had just kept showing his heels that day, or on one of the others. But people like Henry never did. People like Henry always came back because people like Henry knew how to use trust. It was the only thing people like Henry did know how to use. First they changed trust into need, then they changed need into a drug. And once that was done, they, what was Eddie's word for it? Push? Yes, they pushed it. I think I'll turn in, the gunslinger said. Thank you guys for sitting down with another part of Majin reading Drawing of the Three. I know it's shorter, but of course, when producing these episodes, I barely look ahead and see exactly how I can split the episodes into manageable chunks, and that I don't break off an episode exactly when you don't want me to break off one. So we're gonna break off here in the middle of a chapter, because if we don't, the next episode is going to be completely out of place. So it's better for us to end it here. Shorter by 5 minutes, hope nobody minds. Tomorrow's will be shorter again, but it's better to have 2 shorter episodes than one big one. Thank you for listening. Long days and pleasant nights, listener.